Welcome to our opening plenary on advancing racial equity in the workforce to achieve an inclusive economic recovery. The COVID-19 pandemic that we've been dealing with for the past 18 months plus really laid bare the racial disparities in the workforce and economic outcomes that many of us have seen and have been tackling for years. The pandemic also put a spotlight on essential workers who played a vital role and who are still playing a vital role in driving state economies and the national economy, even though many essential workers earn low wages. People of color and women of color are overrepresented in these occupations for historical and systemic reasons that are still with us today. Furthermore, in addition to low wages, those jobs sometimes have unhealthy or dangerous working conditions. And then for workers who are not in essential jobs, for workers who lost their jobs during the pandemic, we know that many of those workers were workers of color, immigrants, workers with a high school degree or less, and workers who sit at the intersection of all of those identities. Those workers were suffered the greatest job losses during the COVID-19 pandemic and are overrepresented in jobs that were hit hardest by the economic downturn. So what do we do about that as equity-minded people here at the Skills and the States Forum? We know that there is definitely a role for us to play. And we know that a huge factor driving these inequities in the job market are inequities in educational and credential attainment. The US has fueled these disparities through decades of intentional structurally racist policies, including those that have shaped post-secondary education and workforce development programs. And our panelists today are helping to turn that around. They are advancing racial equity in workforce development through their own spheres of influence and are here to discuss the policies, programs, and best practices that promote the economic prosperity of workers of color and immigrants who have been historically and sometimes currently underserved by systems and institutions. We have with us Luis Quinones, Director of Adult Education and Workforce Development Programs at UNIDOS, Dr. Alex Camardel, Director of Workforce, Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, Dr. Nomi Custodia-Lara, Vice President of the Lawrence Campus and Community Relations at Northern Essex Community College in Massachusetts, and Shauna Marbury, General Counsel and Senior Vice President of Talent at the Greater Cleveland Partnership. I'm overjoyed to have this group of folks here with us today, and we are going to start with Luis. Luis, UNIDOS is the nation's largest Latino civil rights and advocacy organization. Through community research, policy analysis, state and national advocacy efforts, as well as community programming, UNIDOS is striving to address the social, economic, and political barriers affecting Latinos at the national and local levels. Can you talk a bit about how states can better serve community-based organizations in delivering high-quality workforce development services to Latino workers?
I want to start by setting the context with a very timely data that we pulled. So we have UNIDOS, we work through an affiliate network of 285 nonprofits that serve the Latinx or the Hispanic community. Out of those 285, we have 185 that provide workforce development services. So we did a survey as part of some of the systemic work that we're doing. And actually the responses, we got some of the data last night. So I'm going to read some data points that can inform the response, right? So I apologize for reading. The first one is we, out of the 185, we had 100 responses. So we think that that's a pretty good response rate. 62% of the nonprofits said that the biggest barrier that they have is lack of funding and staff is the largest barrier to meet the workforce development needs of their community, right? They said that the next barrier is lack of external partnerships, and that can look partnership with government, partnerships with private sector, and so 71% of those nonprofits said it's either lack of money and staff, or we don't have enough partnerships that can support the work that we do in our communities. However, they also said that 70% of them have reported that their services for workforce increased within the past year and a half, right? So it's kind of like we don't have enough employees and funding to support the need of our community, and now folks are knocking our doors even more, right? And while 67% of them reported that they feel confident with their skills and the knowledge to serve the community, they don't have the funding, but also the tools that they need as it relates to technology, innovation, so they can kind of respond to that growing demand, right? And so just kind of like want to lay that context first, right? When it comes down to what states can do, first thing that I always say is advocate, right? We have to advocate at the federal level to ensure that we're increasing the funding for workforce development programs in apprenticeships and other opportunities that can lead our Latinx individuals and other people of color, right, and underrepresented communities to get jobs that are not going to be low wage and dead-end jobs. We want family sustaining wages for people, and we also want upper mobility, right, and as it relates to careers. And so the other piece that I'll say is you have to get familiarized with us, with the Latinx community. You have to understand who we are, what are our needs, and what are the nuances of the Latinx community. When we talk about mixed status families, what does that mean? When we talk about DACA, what does that mean? And how are we supporting these subgroups, right? I think we at Unidos, we pride ourselves in doing culturally and linguistically relevant programs that respond to the needs, right? So that's the kind of interventions that you have to put into place in order to serve those communities. The other piece that I'll say is promoting collaboration and coalitions. Currently, Unidos is part of a national coalition called Rework America Alliance that is aimed to respond to the unemployment crisis that COVID-19 created. And so coalition, because those coalitions are going to allow more opportunities for best practices sharing, for funding opportunities. And so really, and when we say collaboration, I'm not just talking about funder and CBO, I'm talking about like the funder, the provider, and the beneficiary, right? The individual who received those services. Another element that I'll mention is you have to break silos, because oftentimes Latino serving or Hispanic serving organizations, we work in silos. Like we get so caught up with the need and responding to that need that it's easy for us to like step back and really connect with others. And I would say my last point on this question perhaps is recognizing the champions. And so we can then learn from each other, right? In creating communities of practices that allow you to leverage the things that are working, because while there are differences from state to state, when we look at California and Texas and New York, of course, there are nuances, but there are also commonalities. And so how are we sharing those successes, but also those areas of opportunity? And so, yeah.
Awesome. You touched on this a little bit, but I wonder if you want to talk a little bit more about how Unidos specifically is bridging education and talent gaps for Latino workers.
Education and talent gap. So the first thing that we're doing is we're really pushing this whole skills-based hiring. It really lets the Latino community, we do have a lot of skills, right? that are transferable skills. So we're really maximizing we are overrepresented in occupations such as the food industry, hospitality. And so what skills we have that are transferable to other sectors that have better pay and more opportunity. And we have done that successfully, for example, with an initiative called Latinos in Finance, where we take individuals who are either underemployed or are part of unemployed, and then we train them. We develop a program where they get trained in the industry specific and the soft skills that they need to then enter the finance sector. We're doing that in partnership with currently three bank partners. So we're doing that with Bank of America, with Chase, and with Wells Fargo, right? So there's a lot of pieces to this. And so then we are creating these training programs that they get infused through our nonprofits and our affiliates, right? And so this is adult education, right? You have to make sure that you are catering to that population. So I think in terms of that, we are addressing the piece of education that you're naming, and that's just one project. We have other programs. In terms of, I think you said talent, right? The other piece, we are also working closely with multiple corporate partners to do two things: change the way in which they're doing their sourcing and their hiring, to become cognizant of like, what are the barriers that you're putting in place in your sourcing and recruitment processes that are keeping all these talented Latinx individuals out, right? So we are doing that through sharing tools with them or doing capacity building sessions. So that's one piece, right? And then I think the other piece is a lot of our programs have corporate partners that are sponsoring that project. But then when we are doing that type of like, you're calibrating demand and supply, right? So we're training all of these individuals, this potential talent, but now you have to hire them. So then we talked about how many openings, what are your markets of priority, to ensure that we're connecting those two players, into the equation.
That is really necessary work. And I'm so glad that we got that data just in time. I'm going to get Alex in the conversation, someone also who knows a little bit about data and research. At the Joint Center, you all create and advocate for ideas that improve the socioeconomic status and civil engagement of Black Americans. And Black Americans are substantially more likely to experience unemployment than white Americans, regardless of educational attainment. Black and Latinx Americans are also more likely to be involuntary part-time workers or underemployed. So can you talk a bit about how you are working to identify policy solutions that center Black workers in workforce development, especially in helping those workers gain access to high quality, good jobs?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for having me to be a voice for the Joint Center. It also, I think I have to share that I was a state advocate in my former role, who has spent a few years attending Skills in the States, and also led the Skills-Based Coalition in the state of Georgia. So while my perspective is on federal workforce policy right now, naturally my heart gravitates towards state policy. So I'm glad I'm still in the orbit with you all. But like Melissa said, the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, I'll refer to them as the Joint Center, is over 50 years old and has advocated for the prosperity of Black communities since our founding. And in the workforce policy program that I lead, my mandate is to investigate kind of what are the challenges and opportunities to make the workforce system, which exists, to aid our communities, particularly low-income Black communities, in moments of crisis. How do we make sure that it's actually delivering on its promises? And I think it's important to underscore that the workforce system and to define it further, being kind of the system that operates on the margins of traditional higher ed. So not just, four-year degree programs, or certainly not graduate school, but more, anything less than a bachelor's degree. There are a lot of ways that that system may or may not contribute to economic mobility that we don't understand, because we've invested in it, or we've updated it, or we've or failed to invest in it in many cases only in moments of crisis. And I think we're experiencing that now, as we are revisiting the conversation at a pretty high level as it relates to the White House plan to Build Back Better, WIOA reauthorization, the infrastructure, the elements of the infrastructure package, and so on and so forth. So our job at the Joint Center is to maybe step back, slow down, and try to understand why, even though the workforce system, the public workforce system as we know it, has been recommended as a solution to aid in the recovery of Black Americans, why are the outcomes still the way that they are? So why, for instance, even today, is the unemployment rate for Black folks in this country almost 2 times higher than it is for all Americans as of August 2021? If we look at our public workforce system, I'll speak specifically about WIOA because it's top of mind right now. Why are the earnings outcomes reinforcing some of the same income gaps that we see in the general workforce population? So for instance, speaking of data, just looking at the WIOA earnings, quarterly earnings data from the last program year, we found that the earnings for Black workers was 78% of the earnings for white workers, 87% for Latinx workers compared to white workers. If you take that and you compare it to the general income gaps that exist among all workers in the US, whether they participated in the public workforce system or not, you would see a very similar trend. What that says to us is that we've created a system that is reproducing disadvantage, economic disadvantage along lines of race, when in fact it should be there to eliminate racial inequities. But instead it's reinforcing them. So the only way that we can truly understand why this is happening is if we slow down and we think about the history of our workforce system, of workforce development, the centuries worth of policy decisions and choices that have contributed to a system that is not effective at eradicating poverty as it should, or eradicating racial gaps as it should. And that's one approach that we're taking, is understanding the history so that we can take into account the actual choices that have made our system commanded a better working system for folks, particularly for folks of color. And then the second piece is to actually listen to workers. That we have a system that is very heavily focused on the needs of employers, and in fact, does not do a good job of sharing power with workers at all. Even if you look at statute at the federal level, if you look at state plans for post-secondary education, even in K through 12 education, where curriculum is designed pretty heavily by employers, there's very little space to explore the needs of actual job seekers, of students, of workers, however you want to, frame folks in the policy debate. And the absence of that in these policy discussions is incredibly clear. And from what we would argue, accounts for the lack of improved outcomes for workers themselves. That cyclical, like the concept of it reproducing some harmful disparities is predicated on the fact that we don't bring in or invite in or even empower workers themselves to be leaders in this movement, in the system, or to design the policy. So we, so we've accounted for the history, and we try to, incorporate that into our research insights and into the evidence that we are building around the outcomes of the workforce development system as it operates at all levels, but again, mostly at the public workforce system. And then we're looking or moving towards a series of projects that will incorporate the voices of job seekers themselves, hosting focus groups with training participants so that we can understand what the challenges have been for them as they've navigated training, when they hop on to look for training providers, what are some of the decision points that they have to make whenever making those decisions. And then we're also interested in talking to organizations and hosting focus groups with the training providers themselves, because what's really important is that we understand what the barriers are for them in terms of actually advancing racial equity. As organizations, as nonprofits, or even in some cases for-profit organizations that are tasked with creating workforce programs, there are a lot of constraints that prevent them from being able to successfully, track outcomes by race and ethnicity, to invest more heavily and targeted in resources into their Black and brown job seekers versus their white job seekers. And a lot of that is an outcome of policy in the workforce field that's super heavy on compliance and compliance and what's the other word that I want to use here? Really, it's just compliance. It's compliance.
I was about to say compliance works.
Yeah, super heavy on the compliance and less on the actual equity purpose. So those are some of the things that we're exploring that I think have been underexplored. Of course, we're building off of the work that you all have been doing at the National Skills Coalition around racial equity in the workforce, and I think has laid a significant foundation. But as we're thinking about, this workforce as a tool for economic recovery, I feel like we can't go into it blind, right? We need to be hypercritical and hyper aware of the potential for it to make things worse. And that's kind of where we are with it. We believe in the potential of workforce to be a really important tool in our recovery. But unless we account for that history of that you lifted up, Melissa, and even Luis, you mentioned, of structural racism in this country, and unless we listen to job seekers and workers themselves, then I'm not too sure we can actually get to an improved system.
Yeah, and on that note of listening to job seekers, I wonder if that kind of foreshadows some of the best practices or policies or programs from states that are making strides towards improving the lives of Black workers. I wonder if some of that, actually listening to workers, is part of that, or whether there are other best practices you want to lift up here.
Yeah, so I will, if I may, the Joint Center is preparing to release, and maybe by the time this is aired, a set of principles that lawmakers should consider for the federal workforce system, which includes WIOA and certainly others. But the main focus, because of the policy moment we're in with reauthorization, is WIOA. But it could also be applied to the implementation of rules and regs, as well as any other state and local activities to advance the goals of WIOA. So a few of those principles, well, I'll name all 5, and I'll try to do it briefly. But the first is to actually implement guardrails to protect Black workers from occupational segregation. So historically, for those who've navigated even and have done all of what we are expected to do in terms of going to school and getting degrees, occupational segregation is pervasive. But this is another, I mentioned earnings gaps out of the public workforce system. This is another outcome that is reproduced by the system as well. So there need to be some guardrails in place. And one of the best ways to get to the guardrails is to actually understand the outcomes disaggregated by race and ethnicity. And what we found at the Joint Center is that rarely, if ever, are those outcomes actually tracked at the program level. So in order to get, so we have, the aggregate insights at the national levels, in some cases at the state level, at the program level, when we reviewed evaluations of programs that were operating across the country, we found that very, very few are actually tracking the outcomes in job quality, in occupation, et cetera, by race and ethnicity. So that's one option. Another principle is that the system has to explicitly acknowledge discrimination in hiring and in the workplace. So workforce is an incredibly individualistic system. A lot of the rules that we impose on folks to even be eligible for services through the workforce system are based on individualism, on personal responsibility and the like. And what that does is it ignores how persistent stubborn racial discrimination is, not even just in the hiring process, but even whenever folks are navigating the training landscape, trying to find options to get new skills, new credentials, and the like. So we need to find ways to actually acknowledge that through our policy. Some of the recommendations that we lifted up are, empowering programs and services to have closer collaborations and partnerships with the EEOC so that programs can actually report habitual cases of discrimination in hiring for people going through their programs. Also, we have to provide resources and support for these programs to understand the nature of racial discrimination in the labor market so they can better support and coach job seekers who are experiencing that. The third principle is about compensating workers that are having to shoulder the costs of training. So we know that there are tremendous opportunity costs in terms of loss of income. Having to not work while you're actually participating in workforce programs is a huge loss. There's also the cost of supportive services that are underinvested in the workforce system, or unfair, and as a result of that are first come, first serve. So people miss out on those, but they could go a long way if they were universally available to workers in the system. For investing in data systems, which I already mentioned briefly. And then lastly, to our point that we picked up on, Melissa, is that Black job seekers have to share power with workforce decision makers. Like, participatory governance is not a completely novel idea in the workforce system. It was something that had more teeth in the former iterations of federal workforce policy, and for some reason in recent years, it has lost its appeal. But it is incredibly important to make sure that we are adopting policies and procedures that correctly address the needs of job seekers and not just the employers. Like, we have to have a balance of power in our workforce system in order for us to even begin to move towards equity. So those are 5 solutions. Like I said, hopefully this will be published and we can share it with folks. But I'm glad that we're in the moment that we're in, because I think this is a good opportunity for us to do some course correction from some of the systemic harms that have been done through the system over the century. So.
Exactly. Awesome. There is so much to unpack there, but I'm going to get Nomi into the conversation here, and hopefully we can come back to some of that. Northern Essex Community College is a Hispanic serving institution that is committed to serving Hispanic and immigrant students by assisting them in earning their degrees and creating a supportive learning environment. And a component of Northern Essex Community College 2020 strategic plan is to expand and strengthen partnerships with the external community, K-12, higher ed, nonprofits, businesses, and community members. Can you talk to us about how Northern Essex has become a vital resource to the community, and how the work you are doing to create equitable pathways for immigrants relates to your position as a resource in the community?
Sure. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here. Northern Essex Community College, like most community colleges, we are a vital agent to the communities we serve. And in our case, we act as conveners, as leader, and advocate to help build a strong local workforce and also fight inequality that leading to fostering socioeconomic mobility. And I want to mention, before I move forward, a little bit about the Northern Essex itself. We have two campuses, one in the city of Haverhill and the other one in the city of Lawrence. And I'm the vice president of the Lawrence campus, overseeing the overall functions of the campus and also fostering community relations. Lawrence is also known as an immigrant city, and it has a high percentage of foreign-born residents. In fact, more than 80% of the population is Hispanic, mostly from the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, and a large concentration of the population also do not speak English. And right now, we have undergoing at the college so many different efforts to assist students, and in fact, we are undergoing right now through a new strategic plan. We are also looking at collaborating with community stakeholders, the private sector, and even elected officials as we're tackling issues that represent barriers for socioeconomic mobility. And I'm going to be mentioning 3 examples that I think highlight the work that we are doing in collaboration with the different community stakeholders. The first one is the Lawrence Partnership. And this is a collaboration with business, community stakeholders, and Northern Essex. And it focuses on building the local economy. The original concept was actually emerged and it was developed here at the college. And it focuses on 3 areas. One of them is support for small business owners here in Lawrence, which the majority are Latino owned. It also has a component of leadership development and a civic and community engagement. The most recent project, which we just did the grand opening last week, is called the Revolting Test Kitchen. And this is a collaboration with the private sector, the Lawrence Mayor's Office, Northern Essex, and a nonprofit organization called E Para Todos, which focuses on supporting Latino entrepreneurs. It is a culinary space that supports small businesses that need an industrial kitchen space and business support. And here in Lawrence, we have a lot of microeconomies that are revolve around food. In fact, most people in the region tells you that the best place to eat food is here in Lawrence. So we have a lot of small businesses that they develop different programs around catering, food delivery, and food trucks. And we felt that this type of project will help foster and collaborate their businesses. So we're very excited about that. Sorry. In my role as a vice president, I'm leading 2 projects that are also aimed specifically at helping our immigrant population. And there was something that was mentioned about the listening to the workers and the job seeker. And this reminds me of this work, because one of the things that we have known with the immigrant population is that often there's a lot of resources available, but nobody asks them what is the best way to access those resources. So often those resources remain on tap. So I just want to bring that into the conversation because, again, there's a lot to unpack there. So one of the projects that we have is called PSlatinos the NECC, and it is a holistic program aimed at helping professional immigrants with the 3 big barriers that push them to low-skill, low-paying jobs. And one of them is English language acquisition, the idea of lack of social capital in this country, and self-advocacy. We have, as part of that, so we have an accelerated contextualized English course specifically for professional. And the idea is that these immigrants are people that already have gone through college. They know how the education system works. They need a fast-paced way to learn English. We also ask them, when is the best time to take classes? So we actually accommodate the classes at a time where they are available to take those classes, because we understand that what they are trying to advance into their skills in terms of learning English, they also need to work. So we are very flexible with that. We also provide coach to the student to help them with the validation of credit. We also help them to connect with industry partners and other stakeholders like the Lawrence Partnership. And with that, to help them build social capital and also expand their networking, which then will help them to get into better careers. So as part of that, we do a lot of work with self-advocacy, and the idea is to empower them so that they can advance, in their jobs. Since 2016, we have helped more than 1,000 immigrants either to validate their credential, continue their education, get into high-skill, high-paying jobs. This is something that is very rewarding to us. The pandemic, it changed the way that we serve the students because we have to go completely remote. And in the process, one of the limiting factors was the digital skills, which while many of them are professional immigrants from other countries, the platforms that we were using are different from the ones they use. So as part of the process, we were adapting to their needs and also help them through the process. So we did a lot of training to WhatsApp, for example, and now they're able to use the platform they use to teach English. So again, it is important to keep in mind asking those that we're serving how we can better serve them. The other project that we're working on, and I'm very excited about this too, has to do with addressing the issue of English language acquisition. Here in Lawrence, we have English as a second language ESOL, Economy Development Consortium. And together there are about 5 major ESL providers, including us. And we have a collaborative under the Mayor ESL Task Force. And the idea in that task force is that we share resources and we also refer students from one program to another one when our programs are full. At any given time, when we get together, we have about 1,000 students on a waiting list. And this is students that are waiting to take classes, and it is something that we would like to address. The barrier to access include not only the English language barrier itself, it's also the cost that might incur into taking these classes, also the seat capacity of the ESOL providers like us, and more. And what is important about this, and this is something that again in a city where we have so many people that do not speak the language, the English language, we see that not having the English language barrier, it also means that residents in the city have less access to essential resources. They also have less access to higher skill, higher wage jobs. And as important, the employers have less access to skilled workers. So often we have that employers, they hire people from outside the town because the workforce is not here. And it's not that it's not here, it's that actually English become a barrier. So for us, creating this new task where we can actually help resolve the issue is very exciting to me. So we are creating a new task force or a new consortium. It's called the Lawrence ESOL Economic Development Consortium. And the idea is to provide accessible and affordable ESOL instruction to every resident of Lawrence who they want at any given time. So the idea is that we don't want to have 1,000 people on the waiting list. We want to be able to provide access to those classes so people can actually further their careers and further their life. So we created a proposal that right now is through the leadership of the president of the college, is going to the State House and working with some elected officials and some additional stakeholders to be able to fund English classes for at least 1,000 residents each year for the next 3 years. And this is important because, at some point, somebody mentioned investing. Usually investment happen at moments of crisis. We want something that is a long-term investment. What we hope is that right now, it is the time to start this project. We will use the funding as a way for us to create a sustainable model. The idea behind these classes is they're going to be contextualized ESOL classes in alignment with jobs in the region, the demand of jobs in the region. It's also going to have a civic component and also a digital skill component, all of those that are important for the immigrant population. And at the same time, if we increase the number of students that now can access English classes, it means that we're going to have a higher demand for ESOL instructors. So as part of that, what we hope is that some of the students that graduate from that program will enroll in another program that we're going to have that is to create ESOL teachers to teach in those programs. So that would be another way for us to create jobs. So we hope that those that go to the program eventually become instructors in the program and continue promoting in the city the importance of learning the language. So those are the exciting projects that we have right now.
Wow, just a few things going on. A lot to unpack there too, and a lot for people to ask about in our Q&A session. But I want to make sure Shauna has a chance to get in the conversation too, because we know that there is a moral and economic imperative to dismantle structural racism within the workforce, and businesses play an essential role in hiring and investing in workers. And Nomi just touched on this a little bit in talking about the programs that she is running. And as an organization that represents businesses across Northeast Ohio, can you talk about your work to close racial disparities that exist in the workforce?
Sure, and thank you for having me as a part of the panel. So I think when we talk about the moral and economic imperative, we first have to understand the depth of the problem. One of the things that we've done at the Greater Cleveland Partnership is encouraged our members and encouraged others in the business community to leverage a tool that we've developed called the Equity and Inclusion Assessment as a first step. It's really a benchmarking tool where companies and organizations can, both in a qualitative and quantitative way, understand their progress or maybe where they need to go in terms of equity and inclusion. They can also receive comparisons to peer companies, whether that's size or industry, and then probably most importantly, best practices to actually begin to make progress or greater or faster progress towards their diversity, equity, and inclusion goals in various areas. So that particular tool has been leveraged in many, many ways. And one of the ways that we're leveraging it right now is in a community initiative around sector partnerships. So in our region in Northeastern Ohio, we have 3 sector partnerships in in-demand industries that have recently catalyzed and started. The business community was actually one of the founding members in what was or is a public-private collaboration through these sector partnerships to connect underrepresented residents to jobs with family-sustaining wages. So our focus is on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how do we connect underrepresented folks to jobs in our community. And it's not just to jobs, but someone mentioned family-sustaining wages. So how do we make sure that we're connecting folks to good jobs with wages that will support their families? Also, when we think about the sector partnerships and the work focusing on those populations, it's intentional. So intentionally leveraging and weaving diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy and efforts has really become a catalyst in our work to closing income and wealth gaps. These are employer-led sector partnerships, so our employers are at the table strategizing in terms of what are the best initiatives, what are the best efforts to achieve some of these goals. And what they've realized, what the business community has come to realize is that targeted efforts are critical to filling open jobs. And when I say targeted, I mean targeted in terms of building skills and developing talent that's already here in pools that may not be fully tapped. So African Americans, Hispanics, other underrepresented folks in our community. So those are critical populations in terms of filling some of the jobs that are available. So we spend time focusing on how do we reach out, how do we develop. We don't want to be in a situation where our companies are really poaching talent from each other, talent that's maybe already developed, or importing talent in a mass way into our region. But we want to reach into these pools of folks who need the development, who want to be connected to these jobs. And I would just say with the sector partnership work, we're focused on really three industries, three in-demand industries in our region. One is manufacturing, the second is IT, and the third is healthcare. So within our manufacturing initiative, we've developed a program called Access to Manufacturing Careers. And we're actually tapping into the reentry population and also opportunity youth. So students who may be out of school age and out of school, or younger folks who have just left school. And we are working to train them, upskill them in an efficient way, and connecting them again to some of these jobs. And what I would say is unique about this program is, again, our employers realize how critical it is to connect with these folks, and they are actually participating in the program and providing guaranteed interviews for folks who complete the program, who complete the training. And we've been very successful thus far in terms of job placements. In our IT sector partnership, we were talking earlier about skills-based approaches. There, we're really focused on working with employers to understand, and this is particularly prevalent, I think, in the IT field or in the tech field. We're helping them understand that job profiles can be broken down into skills that go beyond a 4-year degree, or don't include a 4-year degree, or sometimes even a 2-year degree. There's many credentials, certificates, etc. When employers actually think about their job profiles and what the actual skills are that are critical to the role, that can be used in addition or in substitution for some of those degrees. And then I think the last thing I would say, just to wrap up my comments pretty quickly, is we know that one of the most impactful ways to tackle the wealth disparity or the income disparity in our community is through support for small businesses and businesses of color. So we have several different initiatives, again, through our chamber, that are focusing on providing supports for small businesses of color. For example, I'll just give 2 brief examples. We have an initiative called Commit CLE, and CLE stands for Cleveland, for those of you who are familiar. This is a supplier diversity program where we've gotten 16 corporations to commit to significantly increasing their supplier diversity spend. And this is with minority business enterprises, so companies owned by people of color. We're also a partner in something called the Business Growth Collaborative, and this is a community-wide partnership of technical assistance organizations that provide services to minority-owned businesses. So the collaborative is really simplifying the process of connecting these entrepreneurs of color with resources that will grow their businesses and ultimately grow their wealth. And then the last thing I would say really quickly is we're incredibly proud to be recently selected to house the Ohio office of the MBDA Business Center. So the MBDA is the only federal agency that's solely dedicated to the growth and competitiveness of minority business enterprises. They help secure capital, help minority-owned businesses compete for contracts, and also think about becoming export-ready and export-friendly. So we know by housing those sorts of services and connecting, again, small and minority businesses to those sorts of services, we can work in a collaborative way to address that income and wealth gap.
So much to unpack here. And because we are running a little short on time, I'm going to just ask before we open it up to the live Q&A about how can the nation, how can states, how can community-based organizations, institutions of higher education, advocates, employers, basically everyone we have represented on this call today, how can we join forces to dismantle structural racism within workforce education and training systems to better serve workers, businesses, and the economy? And that's a huge question, but just some top line thoughts to take us into the Q&A would be good. I'll start with Louise. We'll go in the same order.
That is a loaded question, but let's see what we can quickly say over here. Certainly, I mean, the piece around the recognition of structural racism and have a dialogue at all levels, right? Like I said, we have to have the dialogue at the state level, local level, at the nonprofit level, at the recipient. Like individuals need to understand that the system in which they are navigating. We have to certainly also advocate to build the capacity of like providers, because they keep we always fund the same organizations, but then there sometimes I've seen how an application can get tossed off because there's a misspelling. Listen, that could be a language barrier. That doesn't mean that you don't have the ability to serve your community. And so really understanding what processes we put into place at all the different levels that are keeping either organizations out or individuals out. The point about skills-based hiring was very poignant, right? Bias training, and I mean, there's so much more, but I'll leave it at that.
Alex, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just I'll say that it's just important right now to just keep speaking truth to power about structural racism in the system, like relentlessly. You have to be relentless about it. And I know that the key audience may include state advocates, and I understand across states it's getting a little difficult and tricky in terms of talking about structural racism. But you got to continue to name it, and you have to be very explicit about the ways that the workforce and education systems have facilitated the racial disparities that we see today. So continued education for us all as advocates is important. We have to continue to learn like the history of how our states have worked and coordinated to make workforce and education less successful at closing racial gaps. And we have to name those in our reports and our fact sheets and our campaign materials and our surveys and our polling. It has to be repetitive, and we have to be very clear and not create space for people to scapegoat. So that's my main advice. I think it's just being very honest and truthful, like telling the unvarnished truth about it is something that we still struggle with today in the workforce field. But I think if we are more honest about the history and kind of really, frankly, what it comes down to is who has power in our system, then we could be a lot more effective at creating change at the state level and at the federal level too.
So, Nomi?
Yes, I'm going to be speaking, to the people that we serve. We have to make sure that as we keep on the front the structural racism, we need to keep those who we serve at the front line. We need to provide them with the tools for self-advocacy to remove them from the multi-generational poverty. There has to be a way in which, as we think about new programs or existing program or modify them, keep in mind how they're going to be receiving those services and ask them, what is the best way for us to help you? Because sometimes we think of this fabulous program, but they cannot access that because they're working, or they are required that this program is 20 hours a week, or they're working already 40 hours and they have families. So we need to be flexible and we need to meet them where they are so we can really be effective and get them to a different level, socioeconomic level.
Right. Last word before Q&A, Shauna.
So I would just add a couple of top level thoughts. I think starting with intention. So starting with the intention of creating equitable solutions, I think that helps us center equity as we begin to problem solve. So we need to think about creating the most positive outcomes for those we want to impact and bringing them into the conversation, as so many of my colleagues have said on the panel. I'm really an advocate when we think about workforce and we think about talent. I'm an advocate of starting early. We haven't had the time to talk much about the K-12 level, but even providing career exposure and opportunities at that level, particularly in diverse urban schools. We know that young people are the foundational, and the schools are the foundational link in our talent pipeline. And we know that there's structural racism in that foundational link. So really starting early, even at that level, site visits, job shadows, internships. And then finally, just access to training opportunities, building awareness of jobs and in-demand industries, providing and maintaining, and this is a point of advocacy, resources to alleviate barriers to participation in some of these training programs or opportunities. So whether that's some sort of pool of flexible funding for childcare or transportation or training fees or some unexpected emergency expense, I think that's critical really to starting to chip away at some of the structural racism we see in the workforce ecosystem.
So that was a very rich discussion. And I think that is where we have to end this portion of the conversation for now. We basically gave folks a teaser for the Q&A. So we're going to stop this portion of the conversation so we can let our audience get in on the conversation with the Q&A. Thank you so much to our panelists for this conversation.